and hi everyone. Can I ask Oliver, just in terms of who's driving the slides, is that you or
It's not me.
no?
It looks like it's Arno's
Ah,
slide.
okay, wonderful. Okay, great. Thanks, Arno. Okay, just wanted to check on that. So, hi everyone. Yeah, many thanks for having me here today. Pleasure to be talking with you all alongside Mindy, Chris, and Arnaud, and we also have some of the ASD team on the line. What we wanted to do today is take you through a little bit of what we're seeing and hearing in the world of responsible sourcing collaborations and impact, and shine a bit of a spotlight on one collaboration in particular, which is Action for Sustainable Derivatives. So if we could just ping to the next slide, please. And the next one, we'll just do a quick round of introductions. We have a number of people on the line today who we've been working closely with. So Mindy Deliri, Chris Sainer, and Arnaud Bonasoli. We've all been partnering on Action for Sustainable Derivatives for the last couple years, and I'm representing the wider group. Maybe I'll just pause and let you all say hi quickly and sort of your perspective coming into the call today, if that's okay.
Sure, I guess since my picture's first on the screen, I'll jump in. Mindy Deliri. As mentioned, I'm the Vice President Responsible Sourcing, Sustainability, and Upstream Procurement, and I actually sit within the procurement organization. So just as context, I sit under our Chief Procurement Officer. So I'm part of the supply chain here at the Estée Lauder companies.
Great, thanks for joining, Mindy. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you. Hello, good afternoon. Chris Sainer, Croda. We are a chemical company with a particular focus on consumer, which is the manufacture of personal care ingredients, home care, and life sciences, pharmaceutical excipients. And so in the context of what we're talking about today, supply chains and palm, we have quite an attachment to that chemistry.
And good morning, good afternoon. It's my turn, I think, to jump in. Arnaud Bonasoli here. I'm project manager at Transition DD, which is a small consultancy agency based in Paris, and we've got the chance to co-facilitate with BSR the ASD, Action for Sustainable Derivative. So it's a pleasure. The company is actually having kind of big expertise on the supply chain and sustainable supply chain, actually. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Arnaud, and great to have you all on today's call. And maybe just by way of introduction, in terms of who I am, so I'm an associate director with BSR. For those that don't know BSR on the line, we're an organization of sustainability professionals that work with our global network of member companies to progress our mission for a more just and sustainable world. And part of the way in which we do that is through a number of initiatives that we call collaborative initiatives, where we essentially bring together private sector actors and wider stakeholders to address complex and often systemic sustainability challenges that require a collective solution. So in terms of an agenda today, we thought we'd start off with a little bit of insights of just what we're hearing in terms of supply chain collaborations, what has been some of the rationale or impetus behind companies rallying around supply chain collaboration, and what we've seen as success to date, and what are some of the emerging trends going forward. And as I said, with a bit of a spotlight on Action for Sustainable Derivatives. So we'll have time for a panel discussion and Q&A. Feel free to pop your questions and comments in the chat box as we go. I believe Oliver is monitoring those as we're chatting. So maybe just to kick us off then, in terms of some context and perspective of what BSR is seeing in the supply chain collaboration space, so where we are today. So we've seen a growing number and I think need and requests for supply chain collaboration over the past years and increasingly today. I think many people on the call will probably be very aware that many of the most material sustainability issues and impacts posed to a company lie very much in the supply chain, and there's certainly no shortage of pressure in terms of taking action on those issues. And I think whether it's looking at scope 3 carbon or labor conditions, deforestation-free supply chains, et cetera, the nature of these challenges and these risks are very complex, and they're often very interrelated in the supply chain, often occurring at quite a distance from where the core operations and indeed the competencies of many companies lie. And as we go further upstream or further and deeper into the supply chain, many companies face challenges of having both visibility as well as influence over those issues on the ground. So I think there's an increasing recognition from downstream players that collaboration is needed when looking at the supply chain, noting that results are more limited when trying to tackle these issues in the situation solo. So in terms of the supply chain collaborations that we've seen to date, I think there's some characteristics. There's been a lot of progress being made around how to work together to try and address some of the issues in supply chains. But I think some of the traditional themes that we've seen coming through have both led to a fair amount of progress, but still there's a fair amount of room still to be made in terms of advancing further and really driving change on the ground. So in terms of the key themes of supply chain collaborations that we've seen, on the left-hand side here, we'll see this idea around the top-down approach, which many on the line will be familiar with, where we see global buyers signaling demand or requirements for certain standards or practices to be implemented through the supply chain, often tracked and asking for that data to come through. That's been relatively successful. We do see that there is minimal engagement, though, beyond the first or second tier of the supply chain. So really trying to go further with that cascading approach can be limited. We've also seen that a number of collaborations have really engaged or at least started around a single burning issue, whether that's scope 3 emissions or human rights, or taking a sort of singular industry approach. And then finally, where we see essentially the development of independent approaches as collaborations are first started. So essentially often having duplicate or even competitive approaches and standards, whether that's in terms of auditing, et cetera, and really recognizing the need of the collaborations to capture a corner of the market to instigate progress. But the counter to that is that we see some collaborations really struggling to reach scale in that context. So if we look at where some of the collaborations are starting to evolve and emerge based on emerging themes based on the track or sorry, if we could move to the next slide, please, based on the experience and maturity that's building within these groups, and also the increasing urgency and need for change, is this idea of bottom-up responsive. So increasingly we see collaborations that are starting to understand that the complex and systemic natures of sustainability risks on the ground really require locally owned, developed, and implemented solutions. So recognizing that downstream buyers and collaborations between those buyers is very much needed, and that plays a pivotal role, but that should and can be shaped very much by the needs of suppliers and also the communities in which we're sourcing from. We're also seeing that collaborations are starting to work to embed more rights holder and multi-stakeholder views in the strategies investments that they're developing. So trying to bring those voices in much more upfront and center in terms of the core purpose of the collaborations. In terms of that sort of approach and that singularity that we've seen in terms of some of the originality of supply chain collaborations, we're seeing as maturity on the issues in the supply chain building is that actually that single approach is expanding out, and many collaborations are taking a much more holistic approach to sustainability in the supply chain, recognizing that the interrelationship of those issues is very much entwined and important in terms of achieving sustainable development across the value chain. And then finally, and I think is super interesting, is that we're seeing this a number of elements starting to coalesce and join up, and whether that's coalescence around key frameworks and things like science-based targets initiatives, NDPE, or other frameworks allowing alignment of downstream and upstream actors on common challenges. We're seeing that downstream buyers are seeing that their role is pivotal in terms of that wider landscape, but the way in which downstream buyers can organize themselves efficiently to be a constructive actor in that dialogue taking shape, and also looking at actually competing initiatives beginning to partner and even merge to better serve impact in the value chain and reach impact at scale. So some interesting themes coming through that we're seeing towards what we're calling this next generation of supply chain collaboration. So if we jump maybe onto the next slide, please, and we can take a bit of a spotlight case study on action for sustainable derivatives, and welcome Mindy, Chris, and Arnaud and other ASD team members that I can now see on the call to jump in as we go. But we wanted to use this as a case study to provide some examples of some of those key elements that were coming through around supply chain collaboration. So Action for Sustainable Derivatives, we are a collaborative initiative co-facilitated and co-hosted between BSR and Transitions. We launched in late 2019, so we've been in operation for just over 2 years as an operational platform to accelerate transformation of the derivatives sector towards essentially a shared objective to have a palm derivative supply chain that upholds NDPE principles. So that's no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation principles, respects human rights, and supports local livelihoods. We have over 25 members representing end users of palm derivatives in the beauty, personal and home care, as well as healthcare sectors, as well as oleochemical manufacturers supplying those end users. So maybe a little bit to bring to life some of the rationale for why collaboration is essential in the derivative sector. So the history of ASD really stems from a shared experience from a number of our founding members working together bilaterally with Transitions to try and navigate the derivative supply chain, and recognizing some of the particular characteristics of that supply chain really requiring collaboration to move forward. So those that aren't aware, the derivatives supply chain is fairly complex and fragmented. It's characterized by multiple supply chain tiers. We often see between 4 to 10, sometimes more supply chain tiers from between end user and source, which means that trying to map and navigate that situation can be very resource heavy and time consuming. It's also highly competitive and a confidential industry given the relatively high value of end products. And we also see that in terms of gaining visibility through the supply chain, spot sourcing and trading opacity can lead to further challenges. So for those that were attempting to map the supply chain, really recognizing that the effort and the resources to do that, once they even got to the visibility of where production was happening, their relative influence in trying to drive change on the ground was limited due to the smaller volumes of the derivative supply chain in comparison to the food, bev, or biofuel sectors. So really recognizing that to try and tackle this, doing it from a collective standpoint could increase efficiency and offload resources from that supply chain mapping process and direct them to impact on the ground, recognizing that supply chain mapping is essentially a tool, not an objective in itself. On the other sort of side of things, I think in addition to shared complexity and shared challenges in navigating the supply chain, there's also a recognition from the mapping that had been done that there is essentially a hypothesis going into ASD that most downstream users of derivatives are connected to the same upstream players and production areas, which means that they are also exposed to the same level of risk as well as opportunity in the supply chain. And indeed, from a couple years of operations within ASD, the results have indeed demonstrate that there is that shared connection to upstream players. Similarly, with links to the same exposure to risk, there's also the shared exposure to opportunity, and recognizing that bringing together a number of different players in the downstream place increase the level of volumes and therefore influence that the derivative sector could play in the sector. So really bringing together a unified voice for impact. And notably, of course, in the palm kernel oil supply chain, which has had less investment and visibility because of the disconnect between downstream derivatives users and production on the ground. And then finally, just to note that given the expansive nature of the derivative supply chain, that actually ASD does have an important reach, and ASD members coming together have an important reach in terms of supply base and the derivatives market more globally, and really a capacity to capitalize on the shared learning of different members. So where we have leading companies that have pushed the boat out, others being able to come on board and share in those learnings and accelerate change, and also the opportunity to innovate and trial new approaches through our collaboration. So if we move on to the next section, I'll just briefly bring that to life a little bit, what ASD does, and feel free to jump in, team, if I've missed anything. But ASD essentially, and thank you, Mindy, for clarifying PK of palm kernel oil, specifics to the derivatives sector. So ASD, essentially, we united under a common impact strategy around no deforestation, upholding human rights, and supporting local livelihoods. And the way in which we translate that into action is in three key ways. So the first is around transparency and monitoring, speaking to those challenges of being able to gain visibility in the supply chain and understanding risk, capitalizing on the opportunity to bring together collective volumes of downstream players and harmonize the approach to supply chain mapping and increase efficiencies. So the team and Transitions and Arnaud will know well, go through a process every year whereby ASD as a whole goes through a collective mapping process to identify where sourcing is taking place. So the key players and production landscapes in the catchment zone of the collective supply of ASD members, and then overlay a risk assessment on top of that. So we can have a very clear idea where there are risk hotspots and be able to focus our efforts on the key players as well as the key landscapes for sustainability risk in the supply chain. That helps to then focus engagement and action, which is our two supporting working groups or areas of focus. So the first one being supply and market transformation. So this is how we collectively as a group build a roadmap to essentially engage both with the derivatives supply chain as well as with the market more broadly, recognizing that there are other sectors and many other actors working upstream and doing lots of good work in the sustainable palm sector. So bringing the unified voice and approach of ASD members to support in those actions and support supply chain alignment towards the common principles of NDPE. And then finally, in terms of positive impact, working together as a group to identify where in those priority landscapes that ASD members could and should be focusing on to invest in projects that are supporting either biodiversity restoration, supporting livelihoods, et cetera, And we've recently just launched our new impact fund, which enables our members to pool resources towards positive impact on the ground. So we can move to the next slide, please. So maybe just to summarize in terms of our journey towards collective action and sort of some of the aspects of how we've built momentum as a group, we have been growing fairly consistently, both in terms of membership as well as representation of the palm derivatives sector in terms of purchase volumes. That's grown quite substantially to a point that it's becoming an interesting number in terms of bringing that unified voice of the derivative sector to the wider sustainable palm dialogue. We spent a lot of our early years just building out and delivering that initial transparency and risk prioritization at pace and at scale. And Transitions hard work with our ASD members and the supply chain to really understand the collective supply chain and the risks and opportunities to be able to inform our framework for action. In the last year, we've been working as a group to really build out some pilots and trials of what collective engagement with the supply chain or with positive impact and projects on the ground can look like. And we've got some good proof of concepts to show that collective action is indeed possible as a group. And as we go forward into this year and the coming years, really looking to scale and take a very joined up approach to action in the supply chain and the market towards our transformation objectives. So going further with a joint up approach, both within the group and growing ASD, but also thinking about the wider players in the sustainable palm industry, whether that's peer initiatives or peer organizations or wider initiatives active in the space that we can join up with to scale our impact. So go to the next slide, please. I'm conscious of lots of talking and don't want to go on for too long, but maybe just to bring that to life a little bit in terms of where these collective engagement mechanisms, where we've really been focusing on them. So in terms of our first year, really understanding the supply chain, understanding where risk lies, and starting to better build the maturity within the group of where we should be focusing our impact. Just to note that we've had 2 years now of collectively mapping the supply chain. We've almost doubled our volumes and achieved rather impressive levels of transparency to refinery and crusher as well as to mill level. So kudos to Transitions and the team for carrying out that process from a collective standpoint. And really in terms of that breadth of engagement with the supplier, noting that more than 230 supply chain actors are engaged as part of that collective approach. So really by bringing together these downstream actors, being able to achieve a lot in a short period of time in terms of mapping of the supply chain and getting visibility of where to focus. Some of those collective mechanisms that I spoke to that we piloted and trialed over the last year to 18 months and are building out and even further. So alignment and guidance around NDPE policies for our members. What does that look like in terms of action and guidance in terms of individual company engagement with the supply chain? We've been doing a lot of work on grievances, looking at which grievances are connected to the ASD supply chain, given the expansiveness of the supply chain that's connected to ASD, noting that there are many, many that are connected. So how do we prioritize? How do we focus? How do we align our management actions and make sure that those are efficient in line with wider actors in this space? And how does that all pull together in terms of a joint supplier engagement strategy? And of course, looking at our collective framework for impact projects on the ground with the launch of our impact fund, and looking to scale that out over the coming years to build our support and build tangible impact on the ground in our collective sourcing landscapes. And then just finally, in terms of the point around both learning from each other and exchanging internally with the group and more broadly with wider peers and players in the sustainable palm sector, we are also using ASD as a platform to innovate and incubate new approaches. So recognizing that palm derivatives, palm is one feedstock in the derivative supply chain, that also coconut and soy derivatives are often mixed together within the formulations that are used by our end users. So we're piloting a collective approach to both of those feedstocks at the moment, with a view to see if we can replicate and expand this approach beyond palm to achieve our overarching objective, if you notice in the name, which is Action for Sustainable Derivatives, so encompassing all the feedstocks that are included. So I think if we move on to the next slide, I think that brings us to a close in terms of the presentation piece. Thanks, Arno, for driving. And I think to summarize, I think ASD, we have some common challenges and exposure to risk that really brought us together. We've seen, really increased efficiency and effectiveness of addressing those challenges by doing it, collectively, whether that's through the transparency work or the positive impact work. We're building a unified voice, and we're seeing that that's leading to some constructive engagement and participation with other players in the sector. And I know from our, or at least BSR's perspective, it's been a really enthusiastic and fruitful discussion of some really proactive and engaged member companies and great partnership with Transitions. So from that perspective, the journey and still much more to come. So with that, I'll stop talking and over to you, Oliver.
Yeah, no, that was awesome. Thank you very much. And Mindy, thank you for asking the question I should have asked, which is, let's find out more about our audience, because I think we can tell, whilst I know there's plenty of your consumer brand peers on the line, there is a massive diversity in the audience as well. And I think that's why, Edwina, I think the story that you told about what good collaboration looks like in responsible sourcing, regardless of what industry you're in, what are the fundamentals? And those fundamentals are changing quite a lot, aren't they? What traditionally companies thought was good collaboration is, I think some of it's been proven to not be as good. And I think the future of that is incredibly important. So I think ASD is, I have to say, one of the best examples of good collaboration that isn't just an ivory tower collaboration, it's collaborating on the ground, it's collaborating with suppliers. And so it's a great case study. And equally, I think we can think about what the translations are for other companies. But we've got, as I said, a brand, and indeed, Chris from essentially in that supply chain as well. So I suppose maybe we can hear from, and let's hear from Chris, you first as a supplier, perhaps. What's been your experience here, and what are things that you've learned from ASD and collaborating with your peers that are relevant in palm, but could be relevant for anyone in any industry collaborating with their suppliers?
Thanks, Oliver. I was thinking, since we discussed the other day, I was thinking what really makes ASD, what has been the success of ASD. And we've got to put it in context, and we have to talk a little bit about palm because that's what ASD is focused on today. The palm sector in home and personal care is, I'm going to repeat some of the points that have already been made by Edwina, but it's relatively small in absolute terms, relative to food. It's incredibly complex. The personal care consumer products industry thrives on a huge amount of innovation and a great deal of complexity, and is very fragmented. As individual companies within ASD, we could pursue transparency, pursue our due diligence upstream in supply chains, but it would involve a great deal more time, effort, and resource than working together as a like-minded coalition, all seeking the same positive outcome, and avoiding a huge amount of duplication of effort. And the real success over these last 2 full years of operation has been obtaining a breadth and depth of data, due diligence upstream in supply chains, because BSR Transitions have developed and engendered a level of trust and cooperation upstream in those supply chains, which, going beyond our tier 1 suppliers, we would all have, as individual companies, have had to have attempted ourselves, without, I am absolutely sure, the level of success. The other thing that it does, aggregating all of our data, our volumes, our connections, gives us a voice in the industry, which again, as individual companies, would be much more difficult to achieve. And it stands out for the sector as a whole, the home and personal care sector. And the last point I would make is that for those of us who work in businesses and companies who are focused on our positive contribution to the UN, United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, ASD addresses this because most importantly, it is SDG 17, Partnership for the Goals, working together for a common positive outcome.
Absolutely. And Mindy, you, Estee Lauder, have got a phenomenal sustainability program that seems to expand and get better and get stronger, and you're hiring and growing and so on. I mean, you are by your nature involved in a million different initiatives and collaborations at the moment. So what does make collaborations good? What makes ASD a shining example of this in your mind?
Yeah, I think that it's a really good question. And I think that no matter what industry or country anybody sits in around the globe, it was great to hear from folks. But I think what we all share in common is that supply chain professionals are just busier than ever and facing unprecedented disruptions, whether it's related to pandemics or geopolitical tensions or other supply chain challenges at the moment. And I think, at the end of the day, most of us don't have infinite resources. So we don't have infinite time to be in a million coalitions. We don't have infinite budgets. So, I think for me, it's kind of three things. I think, being really targeted in terms of, I think every other month, I get invited to a new coalition or consortium or industry working group. And a lot of them sound interesting and exciting. But I think if I went back to the business wanting to join all of them, I'd pretty quickly lose credibility. So I think picking the opportunities that are really most impactful and aligned to your core values. And that, brings me to my second point, which would be that, you need to really be able to clearly articulate how your participation will concretely make a difference. So why is it important for your company to show up? Versus letting others kind of tackle the issue. Do you have the most purchasing power? Do you have a brand name that can help raise awareness? Do you have an opportunity to really engage key suppliers and bring them to the table? Kind of thinking through what you uniquely can bring to the table, I think is really important in picking an initiative. And then last, I think you need to really be able to connect the initiative to your business goals. And specifically, it's powerful if you can connect it to the strategic goals outside of just the sustainability benefits. So, thinking about something like ASD, for example, how will that partnership also increase transparency and therefore increase resiliency and minimize disruptions within your supply chain? Or how might it drive brand value or create storytelling opportunities, for your brands to be able to connect with consumers? So I think that, programs that also make good business sense are the ones that really have staying power, frankly.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. And I said, welcome to take questions from the audience. Guys, if you want to put some questions into the chat or put your hand up, if you've got a thought or a comment, doesn't have to be a question, then please do. Edwina, I wanted to come back to your kind of view of what next generation supplier collaboration looks like, which sounds all very cool, actually. A next generation supplier collaboration. I think that's what we all want. It sort of highlighted to me that ultimately we do need to involve and engage on the ground. I think that's often a theme that's talked about in the best, certainly responsible sourcing collaborations. You need to know what's happening on the ground, not have this ivory tower view of what you think is happening on the ground, and you need to be able to actually track that impact. I think, and a question that always get asked is, how do you measure impact in these initiatives and these collaborations? And what's some of the ways that you guys have approached that? And perhaps Chris and Mindy, you might have some examples as well, but how do you prove to the business that this isn't just talk, it's actually having some action as well?
Sure, it's a good question, Oliver, and thanks for that. I think, you know, tracking impact and verified impact is always a challenge. I think the way in which we started thinking about that with ASD is recognizing that within the palm industry, there is a lot to be leveraged, you know, in terms of sustainable palm, the issues that are identified, the material issues that exist, those that are working on tracking risks, measuring impact on the ground, making sure that what we're developing as a group is aligned to the wider industry standards and approach. You know, I think within ASD, the way that we've developed it is focusing really around an impact strategy and having that being the orientation to everything that we do. So whether it's looking at the transparency exercises or whether it's looking at the monitoring of grievances or impact projects in the field, making sure that there is a way to tie that back to our overarching impact framework. In terms of sort of measuring traction, we tend to look at things in two ways. So one is looking at outcomes and impacts. So we have the outcomes that we're looking to achieve as a group, which is really the change of behavior in terms of the companies that we're engaging with and the sector as a whole, and then looking at impact in terms of deforestation free, upholding human rights, and supporting local livelihoods. I will be honest, we haven't, you know, gotten down to the nth degree in terms of tracking that, you know, collectively as a group. We're still working on that, and we're looking to partners for support on that. And welcome, Arnaud, if you want to jump in here as well, in terms of some of those conversations. But it's an ongoing journey, and I don't think anyone's cracked the nut there. But I would say that we very much look to have impact be at the center of how we frame the activities that we're developing in the work plan that we put forward for ASD.
Excellent. Anything else to add on impact?
I think we can also highlight the fact that impact is one thing, but one of the core mission of collaborative approach is also to mitigate the risk. And what we are doing is also a big risk management activity. What was highlighted by Chris and highlighted also by Mindy is the complexity of the supply chain by itself and complexity of the procurement activities. And because of that complexity, we need to find solution. Collaboration is one of the solution, not the only one. But I guess when every company is doing its risk mapping, prioritization of risk, and when the companies see that the maturity of the supply chain is not good enough, or if the leverage of the company is not good enough or not sufficient in the supply chain, it has to go through collaboration. It has to find the right voice or to find the right tool to get the voice heard in the supply chain to try to achieve something and to try to have the positive impact, but also to mitigate the risk of the company, to keep all possibilities open and to make the greater choice at the end for the company and for the business as well, as much as for the future of everyone. I think the impact is hardly measurable at that point, but to keep business running at some point, and it's already difficult at some point.
Agreed. I have been sent a few questions, somewhat privately, which I think says a lot. But Chris, this one's directed to you in terms of the business case for taking part. How do you justify it to your business? I suppose customer engagement is a key part of it. And also, does this allow you to have genuinely honest conversations about difficult subjects with your customers and your peers about this? Can you discuss the kind of elephants in the room about the challenges of cost and everything else?
Yes, I can. Without going into the sort of granular detail, in our company, we consume palm derivatives in 14 of our manufacturing sites all around the world, and they comprise 300 separate palm-derived raw materials from over 100 suppliers. So yes, we could engage and do engage with our key suppliers on all manner of sustainability discussions, but to map upstream transparency of all of those palm-derived raw materials would, as I said earlier, only result in a limited degree of success, because going beyond our tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 upstream in supply chains is extremely difficult. And there is a much greater degree of transparency these days. In the old days, going back a few years, nobody wanted to provide any information. You know what I mean? There was a block on, you know, where you buy your raw materials from, why are you asking, you know? But there is an acceptance now of a high degree of transparency. And again, Transitions, working as a coalition, the going upstream as Transitions do, BSR Transitions do, have engendered this level of trust and cooperation from the key suppliers upstream, which as individual members, we would have found it very difficult. We'd all have had to work very hard to have done that. The cost, yes, it would be more expensive than working with BSR Transitions and being a member of ASD, and with a far lesser degree of success. But putting a price on that, it is absolutely necessary for us because we're entrusted in providing ingredients into fast-moving personal care consumer products, and the integrity of supply chains is paramount, absolutely paramount. We have to treat our supply chains as an extension of our own operations. We have to manage that level of risk and commit to that level of due diligence. How do you put a price on that?
Yeah.
And also publishing the outcome. You know, in our corporate reporting, we provide a significant level of detail as to the level of engagement we have upstream in our supply chains.
Excellent. There's another question here. Thank you, Chris. Mindy, I might come to you first, but you might all have a view on this. Obviously, this is the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, and there's procurement professionals kind of listening in. And sometimes responsible sourcing collaborations, sustainability collaborations involve everyone but procurement. And sometimes, in my experience, the moan has been about in those initiatives, how do we get procurement engaged? So for busy procurement professionals who, again, have got lots of things on their plate and there's a million different initiatives that they can take part in. Mindy, perhaps how do you sort of use this information and translate it, engage procurement with it? Are procurement involved themselves? And what would you like to see improved from procurement professionals? What sort of inquisitiveness and questions do you want them to ask you?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. And I often feel really lucky that I started out in my intro pointing out that I sit within procurement. And that's a really big deal because, you know, they're my colleagues and my partners, whereas sometimes I speak to responsible sourcing teams that are, you know, parked within another part of their organization, and they have this struggle to bring procurement colleagues to the table. So I feel like by responsible sourcing sitting within procurement, I already have a bit of a leg up in terms of getting procurement's attention and engagement. This is very much embedded in our procurement strategy. So right up there with cost, with service, with quality, agility, sustainability is front and center as a part of our procurement strategy. And so everybody knows that it's not just my team that's accountable for this. At the end of the day, it is our procurement colleagues. And I think, frankly, if you think you're going to move the needle, on a program with suppliers and you're not engaging procurement, you're kind of sunk before you've started. Your procurement colleagues are going to be the ones that hold the relationships with the suppliers, that know those suppliers in and out, know who to go to, know who to partner with. So I think, that partnership is critical. And in terms of how you engage, I think quite often a lot of procurement folks, really are eager to work on this space. And I think I even saw in the chat, somebody that mentioned wanting to move into a procurement role that had more of a sustainable path. So I think especially, in our younger team members, they're coming in really wanting to work on projects that make a difference. And so I think there's a lot of enthusiasm. And if you run into colleagues that are not of that mindset, are not so enthusiastic, I think it goes back to what I was saying in terms of connecting to the business objectives. So, if deforestation is not top of mind for you, I'm sure business continuity is, and I'm sure that, minimizing disruptions and, protecting the future supply are all top of mind. So how can I connect the work back to those objectives and, let you know how, how your participation will help you to meet your other business objectives, I think is the best way to get excitement and gain some traction with procurement. And I don't know, Chris, if you want to add to that at all from your perspective.
I can remember the days when procurement were focused primarily on cost and service. You know, we'd like that tanker of raw materials to arrive at 2 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon at this price. I would rather suggest we probably, a number of our procurement individuals around the world probably spend more time talking to suppliers about non-price related subjects than price. Quality, service, innovation, and cost have always been the metrics by which most businesses, suppliers, business, customer, supplier relationships are judged. Quality, service, innovation, and cost. Sustainability is now a fifth metric by which we certainly judge our raw material suppliers, and how we, I think, are judged by many of our customers around the world. The weighting that sustainability has within those 5 KPIs can vary, but it is a prerequisite to doing business today, and that means supply chain integrity. We have to know where our raw materials are coming from. We have to know that they are not contributing to deforestation, loss of biodiversity, and there is equitable sharing of benefit as far as it is possible in the supply chains. These are fundamentals now.
Absolutely. Edwina, procurement professionals love to get stuff done, and they don't like sort of idle chit chat about stuff. And I think probably one of the things that BSR has highlighted most recently and very well is that collaborations have got to move beyond just talking and action. It's quite easy to cry on each other's shoulder about how difficult it is. I mean, today's been a bit of that, but hopefully it's been practical as well. How do you think BSR is sort of addressing that challenge of needing to actually almost separate out action and talking, and how does that work, and what do you think is the future of that?
Interesting question, Oliver. Thanks for that. And I think, yeah, I think there's 2 elements there. I think the talking elements and those forums for exchanging and networking are important, and they're important, I think, in terms of identifying what are those common challenges or what are those common opportunities that actually collectively taking action on makes more sense rather than doing it unilaterally. So I think, you know, that type of forum still has its purpose and its merit. You know, I think there's a lot to be said for the exchange and the networking aspect as well, and others learning from trials and pilots in this space. I think when it comes to action, though, to your point, you know, I think we hear a lot that, you know, we're looking for where can we drive change through collaboration? How do we move beyond that sort of dialogue phase? And I'd say some of the themes that are coming through around how to do that or where that is happening is around having a strong unifying sort of strategy around what it is we're trying to do here, you know, whether it's the impact strategy with ASD or a scale strategy with some of our other collaborations, et cetera. And then very clear governance and roles and responsibilities of how to translate that into activities. And some of those activities might be done by the Secretariat or the partners involved, like the transitions work on the transparency exercise with ASD. But one of the things that within ASD we're working through at the moment is around those areas of collective action to engage the supply chain, to engage the market. There is a limit of where the ASD Secretariat plays that role, and there is the point at which our ASD member companies come in and have to play a sort of active role there. And indeed, they're meeting that with gusto and enthusiasm. So, you know, I think that understanding where one role starts and the other one finishes, and just being very clear of how to take that forward under the appropriate governance structure. And then just to add to that, I think a key element is in maintaining in that pre-competitive space when we're in that collaborative forum. So maintaining that antitrust compliance piece, and then where there are opportunities within the supply chain to, you know, take things forward on a commercial basis, et cetera, allowing that to happen, but outside of the group and not having the collaboration, you know, get involved in that, and being very distinct around where those boundaries are.
Excellent, excellent. Very conscious of time, but there is a very public question. We've just finished the private ones. I'm going to ask this just to you, Mindy. How do you balance sort of dealing with these sorts of things internally versus working with the likes of BSR and others to do this collaboratively? How do you kind of balance that and make those decisions?
Yeah, I see that question. So I think that frankly, it's a mix for us. There's, an awful lot that we manage and internally, and then there are instances where we, need extra support. So if it's an area that, we're just starting to get engaged and we need, somebody that has a bit more experience in the space, if we need a local context, if there's only so much from my office in New York City that I understand about the world. So maybe I would like, support from a local partner that really, has more knowledge of the on the ground situation. So, I think that it really, I don't know if that's a good answer, but it's a mix for us in terms of when, we do things internally versus bring in external partners.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Just Punita Patel, you ask if there's anyone know of any supply chain sustainability program maturity benchmarking information. If you look at the SPP's new Gartner thing we've launched today, that is in some part attempting to get a sense of how everyone's doing on responsible sourcing and sustainable procurement. So a little plug for that. AIM Progress's responsible sourcing benchmark is a really good resource that I know, Mindy, you know well as well. So guys, I would Google AIM Progress responsible sourcing benchmark. That will help you, Punita. We haven't got much more time left, and I need to hop to yet another session. So, Mindy, thank you. You are brilliant. You're always brilliant every time we involve you in absolutely everything. So thank you so much. Chris, your insight is always good. You make it sound like you've been doing this for so long, and I think you probably have, but you don't look like you have. So that's a good sign, isn't it? But thanks very much for your insight. And Edwina BSR, as I said, I thank you so much for your input. I have a Google Doc of 187 sustainable procurement initiatives, everything from potatoes to aluminium and everything else. And definitely you guys run some of the best of them. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you, everyone that's joining us. And see you again for the next session. If someone can come, that would be great.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.